Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm David Suddjian, and this is Bird Bomb's Helpful Bursts of ID Info. Tonight here in Colorado, near my home, it's snowing and it's about 16 degrees outside. So, you know, I'm California dreaming, and I want to give a shout out to my California friends that are watching tonight, especially to Karen DeMello. Hope you're out there, Karen. So our topic tonight is the forest hawks. So these are our accipiter species. They're at home in the woods and built for living amid the trees. So these birds have short, rounded wings and long tails that enable them to fly through the forest, through the tree canopies without hitting anything and to do their hunting, and that's where their core area of living is. Of course, we also see them along habitat edges and in developed areas here in the Denver metro area, in the urban area, and in urban areas throughout. We can find accipiters, especially at this time of year, but even during the breeding season. So tonight we are talking about birds in the order Accipitriformes and in the family Accipitridae. And it's a big family of birds, including a lot of those different groups you see listed with the order. And we're talking about the genus Accipiter. And Accipiter has about 50 species worldwide. It's the largest genus in the family. And here in Colorado and across all of the US, with the exception of a vagrant species, there are just 3 species of accipiters. But that's enough because they present some challenges for us. So as I said, these are small to medium-sized hawks adapted to living in the forest and woodlands and along edges with their short, broad, rounded wings and long, narrow tails they can maneuver. And they have a characteristic flight pattern that's different from the bootios and different from falcons and other birds of prey, where they make several short, rapid wing beats punctuated by a glide. So we have these 3 species as our focal species tonight: the sharp-shinned hawk, Cooper's hawk, and the northern goshawk. So they're arranged there by name and according to size, and I've got the 4-letter codes for them, but I'm going to be using these nicknames as we go through our bird bombs tonight: Sharpie, Coops, and Gauze. And notice it's goshawk, not goshawk. Now, when you see one, you do say, gosh, look at that hawk, but it's a goshawk, and so we're just going to call that the gauze tonight. Now, we have to be honest, and we have to be humble and admit that there is a 4th accipiter out there, and it's Accipiter spa, the unidentified accipiters. The thing is that the accipiters are among the most misidentified of all our birds. And so if we're being honest in our birding, we've got to let some of them go as unidentified. I know it's hard, but it actually shows you're a better birder if you realize, you know, that view was too short or too far, or I didn't see what I needed to see. So you can put down Accipiter spa on that eBird checklist, and that's a good thing to do. So let's leap right into the status and distribution question. I always like to begin with that because that's our framework for understanding bird identification. We got to know what occurs and when it occurs and where and even why. That helps inform our identification process. So here we have a look at the birds in the greater Denver metro area counties. So this includes some mountain terrain up to high elevations, like in Boulder County, for example, and also the urban area and some surrounding prairie that's in these counties. So it's kind of a mix. And what you can see is all 3 of our species are represented in this area. The Cooper's hawk is by far the most frequent and the most numerous in terms of overall numbers that you encounter in general. And it's the only species that nests in the urban area. The Sharpie and the gauze are much more limited in their distribution during the nesting season. But we see that all 3 occur year-round. Look at that green line on the bottom of the goshawk, barely kind of scraping its presence in there compared to the other 2 more frequent species. But it is around, and it's just more thinly distributed, harder to find. We see some peaks in the fall and spring, especially accentuated for the Cooper's hawk there. That does involve some migrants passing through. That dip in the middle part of summer where we see the frequency dipping down, some of this relates to migrants that have gone through and moved on, and we've got a core breeding population, but they also become a lot less vocal at that time, where they're calling a lot early in the spring. And so even though it seems like their numbers are decreasing there, actually they're harder to detect during a part of the nesting season when they are a lot more secretive, even though earlier they're very noisy. So that's kind of the greater Denver metro area. Now let's take a look at three sort of sub areas. Let's break it out. We've got the Central Mountains, so we're leaving behind the low foothills and the low areas near the Front Range. And we've got the Denver urban area, which is strictly just Denver County. And I think I have Broomfield in there and maybe something else, but it's very much just the urban setting. And then the Eastern Prairie on the right-hand side. And you'll see the distributions of frequency of these species is different in all those areas. All three species occur in all those areas. But if we look at the mountains on the left-hand side, we see that all three nest there, and that they're all most frequently detected during the breeding season. In the winter, they have a lesser presence. And we see the goshawk makes a nice presence there compared to its presence here in the urban area where it's really sparse. And in the summertime, breeding season, the heart of the breeding season, the Cooper's is the only one that's around in that urban area. The goshawk is rarely noted in the urban area, but this is the time of year when we can see them if you're living down in Denver and Boulder and the other towns and cities along the Front Range, because they do range down into our area at this time and through the winter. Out on the Eastern Prairie, it's kind of interesting because during the fall and into the winter, we see the sharp-shinned hawk has a nice presence there, even though it's absent during the breeding season, has a nice presence at this time of year and on into the winter. So a little different from place to place. And let's think about what do we look at when we are looking at accipiters. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is on the left-hand side, we have an adult. By the way, these are all Cooper's hawks in this image. And we have a juvenile. And here I'm going to use the word juvenile tonight, but we could say immature. But the birds pretty much don't molt out of their juvenile plumage until they get into their next molt cycle, for the most part in later spring. So we can still use this word juvenile, and so I'm just going to clarify. We could also say immature. So notice the adults have, they're dark above. We can't really see this guy's upper parts except the top of the head, but they're basically blue or brownish, bluish, grayish above, depending on the sex, and red barred underneath. See these horizontal barrings of reddish coloration. Versus the young birds, they're brown above and they're streaked with vertical markings on the underparts. So a real difference there between the two, and you can pretty much always, given a decent view, age them. And that's helpful to consider comparing species and which ones you're looking at. Another thing I pointed out here is that when you're looking at the underside of the tail, you can see the tips of the tail feathers. We'll look a little bit more at that in a moment, but that's an important feature. Some other things I have called out on here, when we're talking about a supercilium or an eyebrow, it's this area from above the eye going back over towards the nape, not very pronounced here on this Cooper's hawk. And we also like to look at head shape, the position of the eye as it appears on the face, and whether it looks big or small-eyed relatively. All right, and if we say the word hackles, we're talking about the feathers on the back of on the nape. The upper part of the nape, the back of the crown, are the hackles. And then sometimes those can be raised up, which is a good feature, say, for Cooper's hawk. Of course, the tail feathers. There's a terminal band on the end, a pale band on the end, white or off-white in all three species. And the breast is marked. That's the breast. And we're talking about the undertail coverts. We're talking about this area right down here with the arrow pointing to it on the lower right-hand image. So those are the undertail coverts, and they're often differently colored in this case or patterned from the breast and the belly area. So here we have some more birds to look at. And when you're looking at the underside of the tail feathers fold together, and you can actually see the tips of the tail feathers. Notice the tail looks different if I look at this sort of central picture. When we're looking at the back side of the bird, we don't see those tail tips lined up because we just see the top side of a few feathers, but we have some broad bands. The banding pattern looks a little different on the underside. Again, there's that pale terminal band. And let's look closely at this left-hand picture. We can see the tips of the tail feathers. Here's the outermost feather. See that white tip separated by this dark bar from the feather behind it? Another tip. There's some more tips piled up in here. There's 12 rectrices or tail feathers all together, and 6 on each side. And as the tail folds and looking at the underside, you can see that feature. So we're going to come back to that. It's a very useful ID feature. When the birds are in fresh plumage, as they are now for the most part, having completed a molt just in fall, late summer into fall, birds molt over a time. We can see these fresh feathers are looking all nice and dandy. Here's a warren bird, this picture taken in May, I believe, and you can see these feathers have been through a lot. And so they don't even have dark tips on some of them, and you can tell by the tips that they're a little older. So that can be useful to consider, because when birds are molting or their feathers are particularly worn, you want to take that into account when you're trying to bring into play some of the things we're talking about tonight. And then when the birds are in flight, we're looking at how the head, looking at the shape of the bird overall, how the head projects out from the wings. In the case of the Cooper's hawk, a nice head projection. We talk sometimes about the leading edge of the wing, or the wrist or bend of the wing, and the trailing edge of the wing. And if you think about, if you hear the word hand in terms of a raptor, it refers to those outer primaries that have a fingered look. So that's the hand of the bird out here, so to speak. Now, one of the features on some accipiters more than others are the undertail coverts may be flared out. When the birds are displaying, most especially in the spring, they often, the males particularly, but both sexes, can flare out these undertail coverts, and it can even look like a white rump. Sometimes the bird goes by and people say, oh, a harrier, you know, but it's not that, and it's not quite the same pattern as a harrier, but it's these flared out feathers that birds do when they're courting, and so on. So one thing that you often hear about is, well, the shins are really skinny, you know, and so on. Well, yes, you can see the legs and feet, and they're lovely to look at, but I'm going to say, let's not bother with those for identification of the accipiters. First off, it's not always so easy to see them very well, but even if you can, there's always other features that are better and stronger to look at. So you almost never can only see the legs and feet, but you have other things to look at. So let's not worry too much about the legs and feet, but you can try to piece them together in this puzzle and see what we have. We've got little lines connecting our images. Of course, you can do the pictures just visually and see what they are. But I think what you notice when you look at this is that, you know, it's not a really good mark in the field. If you have the birds in the hand and you're measuring the diameter or radius of the tarsi, then you can do something with that. And they wear different size bands reflecting those differences. But in the field, it's not so useful for us. So that we're going to leave that behind after this slide. And let's consider that these birds are different sizes, and they don't overlap between species, but they do overlap between males and females. The males of all three species, as with raptors in general, are smaller than the females. The size difference is greater in accipiters than in any of the other hawk groups. It's very marked. In fact, the sharp-shinned hawk has the greatest sexual size dimorphism of any bird in the US, so I've read. And so the male sharp-shinned is really our smallest hawk, and it's a tiny little bird. The female's bigger yet, but the female sharp-shinned is not as big as the smaller male Coopers, and the female Coopers, while bigger than the male Coopers, is not as big as the small, as the female, a male goshawk, or certainly the female goshawk. So they range without overlapping between species. That doesn't help us a whole lot, because normally, except during a hawk watch situation, you really don't see them together. And even there, here in Colorado, it's not that frequent when you can see certainly all three species together, even two. So it's hard to get direct experience comparing size, but you can compare to other things, and you can just develop over time a sense of the size of the birds. Got some measurements up on the top, just kind of showing how they don't overlap, and the great disparity in size from the little male sharp-shinned hawk weighing, you know, maybe 3.5 ounces on average, to the male goshawk weighing maybe, you know, 30 ounces on average. So that's a huge difference in size between those species. On the left, we can see some kind of species I've thrown in here. Give us a general sense of the size of these birds. The raven is about the same size as a goshawk, or a goshawk. Gauze is a little smaller than a red tail, similar to maybe a broad-winged hawk in size. Coops is like a crow, and the Sharpie, kind of like a robin to a flicker in size. So they're pretty little. The juveniles have longer tails than adults. We won't worry anymore about that tonight. They also have differences in eye color between the sexes and the age of the bird. The females have kind of orange eyes, the males a nice deep red color. Very beautiful. Juveniles, though, have differently colored eyes. They're generally yellow, paler, sometimes brownish yellow. So these are features you can look at that are good to get a sense of as you're considering what species, especially when they dash by. Now, a lot of the times when we see accipiters, we see them in basically three ways. We can see them flying overhead, up high at some distance, maybe soaring, maybe just passing through, or we can see them perch, or we can see them hunting when they're dashing at high speed, often down fairly low to the ground when they're hunting. And so out of those three modes, we have different things we can try to grasp. Among the most important things to consider is trying to get a sense of the bird, get a sense of its size and shape and all that, especially if it's passing by quickly. You'd think when they're perched, it would be easier to identify than in flight, but actually perched birds can be very challenging, particularly if the views are less than optimum and you can't see the whole bird. Indeed, as you look through the slides tonight, or the images on my slide, you'll see a lot of them have sticks. The birds are in trees, in vegetation that can obscure what we're looking at. So on this page, we have a selection of images of adult Cooper's hawk. So we'll start with the Cooper's hawk. It's the best species to learn really well because you're going to see more Cooper's hawks than any of the other two here in Colorado and in many places. So it becomes kind of a reference species. It's also in the middle for size. So you learn the Cooper's hawk well and you can get a sense of the smaller Sharpie and a sense of the bigger gauze. All right, so Coops are medium-sized hawk, medium to large, and they have a lanky look about their overall shape, with relatively long tails and long necks, relatively large-headed look. The adults have a blackish cap that contrasts with the paler nape. As you can see in the upper right image there, the dark cap is darker than the gray nape, and so there's a contrast going on there. Coopers often will show a squarish head. You get a sense of that in this middle left image. Sometimes that varies in terms of what you see, depending on what the bird's doing and whether its hackles are showing. You can see hackles, I think, in the top center bird. And that the males and females have some subtle differences in their coloration. The males are generally redder underneath, but on their cheeks they're grayish, and the females often have a reddish or orangish cheek. The tail on the Cooper's hawk is often rounded appearing. It is always rounded, but it doesn't always appear so rounded, especially when the bird's perched and the tail feathers are folded over or where it's flying over with the tail closed. But even on these perched birds, you can see that the tail does have a rounded look to the end. And again, the outer tail feathers are shorter, and that's revealed by the pale tips that you can see as the feathers are overlaid. So on this pretty bird with the red eye, this is a male, pretty slim and trim. Females are heftier. Here's a female next to him. You can see that here's the outermost feather on this side of the tail is folded over, and there's a fair distance between the end of that feather, which is this white tip that I'm pointing at right there. If you can see it, to the end of the tail, has a pretty moderate distance in it. So the adult Coopers, or Coopers in general, it's fairly large, lanky, large-headed, nape contrast on the adults, a long-tailed look, and a rounded tail. So let's move right to, here's a nice feature of an adult female. Again, showing those nice undertail coverts that are often kind of flared out looking on the Cooper's hawk, even in this non-flight view, obviously from the wintertime with snow on the railing there, probably near a bird feeder or something. Notice her eye is more orangey, not so red as the guy right above her here, or the other one that's underneath the image right now. So females orangey eyes, adult males red. So how about the juveniles? Gosh, when you look at these pictures, one thing that kind of strikes you is they kind of all look the same. And that's kind of true too. If you were to throw Sharpie images up here and even gauze images up here, there's a lot of commonality. Basically, brown streaked birds on the underparts, brown above, and with variations on that theme, but there are some subtle plumage details we can look at. With the Cooper's hawk, they have often a tawny head and a nape that contrasts with a browner back. In this lower right image, you can see couple things. You can see that hackled look where the bird has its feathers on the rear crown raised up, giving it a flat-headed look, and you get that kind of hackles showing, but also this tawny color on the nape contrasting with the browner, darker brown upper parts. On the Cooper's hawk, as in the others, there are streaks. The Cooper's hawk has these fairly narrow, short, dark streaks, and they kind of, in our birds, they tend to peter out on the lower part of the belly and become pretty sparse. And the undertail coverts are generally, or are, as a rule, are not marked. Now look on this bird taking into flight. His undertail's way back here without marks. This is still the bottom of the belly on this particular bird. On this bird with the worn tail on the right, you can see the undertail coverts unmarked there. And same thing on the lower right hand. So that's actually a good mark to compare with gauze later on. And the tail with the overlapping tips. So let's look at this image second from the left on the top row. You can see here's the tip of an outer tail feather, much shorter than these other ones that are also lined up here on this underside view. Same thing in this lower center view. Here's the outermost feather, much shorter than the end of the tail. All right. Here's a classic juvenile Cooper's hawk. Again, notice the undertail coverts unmarked, the shorter outer tail feathers showing in this nice view of the undertail. If you ever can see the undertail, it's something you want to be looking at. It's kind of got its hackles going. It's a little bit ruffled back here, not too pronounced. That can vary depending on, you know, what the bird's doing, how it feels, what have you. Cooper's in flight. So if you're out of hawk watch, that's one of the things you're hoping to see is accipiters going by, and you get a good chance maybe to see a number of accipiters passing by. Otherwise, this is one of the more common ways that we'll see the birds, especially if they're overhead and you're listening to your local birds and they all of a sudden get quiet or even put up an alarm call. You may have a hawk circling right overhead. What we notice on the flying Cooper's hawk is that it's kind of shaped like a cross. Look at this image of the upper right-hand corner. And you can see that my mouse disappears, there it goes, that it kind of looks like a cross. It's because it has fairly narrow, longish, relatively straight set wings and a long tail and a head that has a good projection. So you get that kind of T effect or a cross effect. Cooper's hawks are fairly heavy and they're solidly built. And when you see them flying, they're very stable. Even if it's breezy or windy, they don't get buffeted about, but they're real stable and strong as they fly along. The head projection ordinarily looks pretty good. As you can see on a lot of these birds, the head sticks way out ahead of the forward bend of the wing. Now that can vary depending on the flight circumstances and what the bird's doing as it's flying. Is it gliding? Is it soaring? Is it losing altitude quickly? Is it gaining speed? Whatever. It's going to be a little different shape, but in general, you'll notice that it has kind of a straight across on the leading edge of the wing with the head projecting well out, way out ahead of that. And notice also that the tail often has a rounded look. So here on the upper left, we have a closed tail with this backlight kind of accentuating things for us a little bit, highlighting those pale tail tips. But you can see overall that it has a rounded look with shorter outer feathers. Once the tail is spread a little bit, it still looks rounded, but it becomes a little harder actually to assess things than when the tail's closed in that regard. And indeed, a sharp-shinned hawk with its tail spread out, its tail's also going to look a little bit rounded. But the difference is that the outer tail feathers on the Coopers are decidedly shorter than the other rectrices, unlike the sharp-shinned hawk. So solidly built, stable flight, good head projection, leading edge straight, emphasizing that head, that cross shape of the body and the wings. And the wings are fairly long and narrow with a long hand. So the hand, remember, are these primaries sticking out where you can see the marginated feathers, meaning the individual feathers. And that long tail with broader, obvious white tips and a kind of rounded shape. So you just want to kind of soak this in for a moment, get a sense of what the flying Cooper's hawk looks like. Most of these birds in this image are younger birds. I can see a couple of them with their tails flared out. It's shadowed here, but these are adult birds and they're in a little bit of a display mode. This is how you might see them, most especially in the spring, but it can be at other times of the year as well. All right, so Here's a classic image of a Coops. His wing's not so straight here because he's kind of holding his wings in a bit, picking up some speed, covering a little bit of ground in between his flaps and stuff, or her. And it's a young bird, we know by the streaks underneath. And we can see again the tail with the shorter outer feathers. And here's several different feather tips lining up towards the tip of the tail, giving it that rounded appearance. Beautiful bird. So a neat thing about the Cooper's hawk, at least in the Denver area and a lot of our urban areas along the Front Range, is they nest there. And so we get to enjoy their breeding activities. The others don't nest down in the urban area, and honestly, they can be hard to find their nests out in the forest. The goshawk is pretty thinly distributed, so it's really a hunt and peck unless you know of a known locality. And the Sharpie can be pretty secretive, so nests can be hard to find. But in town, the Cooper's hawk is fairly common breeder, and during the winter time, and then when nesting season is beginning, before the trees have leafed out, we can see their nests up in the trees, like this one in the upper right. They will reuse nests over multiple years and may have 2 or 3 nests that they rotate between. They can also build a new nest if they need to or want to. Here's one collecting nest material. Here's adults. You can see it's early in the spring. These are birds that are perched up and calling from those positions. We see a nest underway here. Hard to see the young in the nest. Here's an adult female at the nest. The female does nearly all the work of the incubation, but the male is involved in bringing in the food. Now, it brings in enough, and these little babies that are going to grow up, either 3 or 4 often, are really cute as they go. Start out all downy and end up looking trim and slim, but still a little bit ungainly when they're ready to fledge. They fledge more in like late June and into July. July is a great time to find families of Cooper's hawks, and they're very vocal after they fledge. So at that time, they're not so secretive anymore and can be very easy to discover. The adults, probably both adults at that time, bringing in prey for the young to eat. And so this is kind of the only time you're going to see a group of accipiters perched together, is around the time when they fledge, and you've got the family group sitting out in the trees. Accipiters do provide nest sites for great horned owls. That's kind of fun. You know, red tails do, and some others also, but the accipiter nest can be used by the great horned owls in years subsequent to when the accipiter nested. And the great horns start early, so they may steal a nest or usurp a nest from a Cooper's hawk. So let's look at the Sharpie. We'll scale down in size here to our smallest North American hawk, and this is a small, lightly built bird. This is an adult male here on the left, and over here as well. Look at this car mirror. You know how big your car mirror is. The bird body is about the same size as that mirror. So this is a small hawk, and it has a relatively appearing smaller head and often a big-eyed look, kind of because of that smaller head. So you can see in a lot of these images that it does look like it has a large, kind of beady, staring eye. So a big-eyed look on the sharp-shinned hawk. It's patterned just like the adult Coopers. There's some subtle differences. They're often more densely colored underneath. The barring is more dense in the orange there. And they don't have the contrasting nape from the cap. So they have a dark cap like the Cooper's hawk, but it blends into a nice smooth color transition to the also dark gray nape. As you can see in this upper right bird, there's like no contrast there, but it's got a dark crown, but the Coopers would have a pale nape here. Notice the undertail coverts right here in these pictures as they're adults. The tail, what do we see? Well, we all know that sharp-shinned hawks are supposed to have squared tails, or you're going to know that after tonight. And indeed, usually the tail does look square. Sometimes it can look a little rounded. You want to consider molt and so on, or even a little bit notched. But usually it's kind of square-ended and kind of narrow at the base and straight on down. So compared to the Coopers, it's a narrower base tail and a little bit shorter, and it doesn't have the shorter outer tail feathers. So when you look at the underside of these guys' tails, you don't see those white tips. So the Coopers would have the last tail feather tip might be up this far, like where my cursor is, but on the Sharpie, the tail feathers are all about the same length. Very good ID feature. These are they also have a white band at the end of the tail like the Cooper's hawk does, but it's narrower. And once you get into the late winter, springtime, early summer, that white is worn away and it can be very unobtrusive. But when the birds molt, or you're looking at fresh birds migrating through in the fall, then they do have a more pronounced white tips on their tail feathers, but it's about half the width of the freshly plumaged Cooper's hawk white tips. Here's a classic Sharpie adult. Indeed, the legs and feet do look skinny, but we don't worry about that. But you can see these tail feathers are all about the same length, even a little bit of a notched effect here. 6 feathers on each side, all overlapping at about the same length. Great field mark, I think. So the juveniles pattern just like the young Cooper's hawks, but these same differences I just mentioned for adults hold true for the young hawks. In particular, we have the more rounded head and a large beady-looking eye. And here again, the feather tips, this one a little bit more worn. And otherwise, it's looking a lot like a Cooper's hawk. Here, when the tail is spread out, you can see that it looks rounded in that setting, but indeed, the feathers are all pretty much the same size. So a spread-tailed Sharpie, you have to evaluate, how it's holding its tail. All right, classic Sharpie, juvenile. And in flight here, we have, we can see that these birds are relatively compact in shape and they have a light build. And so when they're flying along, any little breeze can tend to buffet them along a little bit, can kind of move them. They're not nearly as stable as the Cooper's hawk. They have a lighter weight, a lighter wing loading. And so they will be buffeted by little breezes. Notice that they often will hold their wings forward at the shoulders. Like here in this lower left-hand side and the image to the right of it, the wings bow forward such that the leading edge and the bend of the wing is about as far out as the head is projecting. So the head is smaller, but it also, because of the way the wing is positioned, seems to have a shorter head projection. The tail often looks squared on the Sharpie when it's flying. And it has to do a lot of flapping to look like it's going to get anywhere. It's not nearly as strong of a flyer as the Cooper's hawk is. All right, so let's get to our third species here, the goshawk. And again, we have adults here on the first page. The goshawk is different from the other accipiters in that it has a unique plumage as an adult with several features that are different. One of which is this nice supercilium or eyebrow, which flares behind the eye and actually wraps around to the back of the nape to meet on the back part of the head, wrapping around the head. So much more, the other adult accipiters don't have any supercilium. The juvenile Cooper's has some look there, but not nearly so bold as on the goshawk. They also have pale whitish to grayish underparts with these fine dark vermiculations or bars, very different from the reddish underparts of the adult Coops or Sharpie. The goshawk is our biggest one. It's like a small bootios in size, and it's heavy set, thick-bodied, and chesty. Adults, as I say, are uniquely plumaged. As I mentioned, they have these broad shoulders and the kind of squarish, relatively small-looking head, as you can see sort of in this bird in the center. The head looks small because the shoulders are so big, the body so bold and hefty. The tail is relatively long and broad, and it often looks like it's tapered towards the tip, as you can see well in this bird here. Look at these talons on this guy coming in for a landing. Wow, that is some business end of the bird. Let me tell you, this is how accipiters do their killing, is with their feet. They'll fly in, they ram the bird, they grab with their talons, and that's how they kill, versus, say, a falcon, which kills by biting with the nail on the side of its bill. All right, here's a beautiful adult goshawk. It's, not so hard to identify this should you be so fortunate for a view like that. Notice also fairly big bill. The young birds, again, look a lot like a Sharpie or Coops, but notice those things I was just talking about. Fairly big, hefty body, long tail, and that supercilium showing up well, even on these young birds. And they often have a what we call a supraloral ridge The young birds show this well, and it kind of creates a little facial disc like a northern harrier impression. So the image here showing where the supraloral ridge is. When you look at the underside of the tail of the goshawk, you'll notice that it has kind of an uneven, wavy, irregular pattern how the bars line up, and that can be a pretty good mark to consider, in addition to just the length of the tail, very broad based on the tail. All right, so there's a very quick tour through our goshawk. Beautiful tapered kind of looking tail here. One thing I didn't mention was it often has a pale wing bar. There's gold highlights here on these wing coverts, creating a pale bar. There it is there. Here it is over on this bird looking over its shoulder. You can see a little bit showing up here, not so easy on this angle. In flight, they are powerful, stocky, and heavy. They recall maybe a small boodio or even a large falcon. I can't tell you the number of times I've got out of the car, looked through the windshield up in the mountains and seeing what might be a falcon or a boodio, but I really think it's the gauze. But I get out of the car and the darn thing has disappeared. And that's often how they present themselves. It's frustrating, but they do look like that. The wing beats are more labored than snappy. Than the snappy beats of the smaller hawk. They have a more tapered wing, so a little more angular shape overall. And the trailing edge of the wing, particularly on the young birds, is more rounded than on the Cooper's hawk. And notice I didn't mention it. I'm going to actually go back if I can. Let's see. We have on this bird on the left, the undertail coverts. You can see markings going down onto the pale undertail coverts, which aren't actually white, but a little off-white. And so the fact that there are streaks on the undertail coverts is diagnostic for us relative to the Cooper's or the sharp-shinned hawk. So in flight, sometimes if you get a picture or you have a nice view, you can see the markings on the undertail coverts, or when the bird is perched, that's something to look for. They also have a pale, prominent pale terminal band on the tail. All right, so quick tour through our three accipiters. This guy is sparsely marked on the undertail coverts, but notice there are some marks here, which among other things is differentiating it from a Cooper's. Okay, so I gave you a whirlwind tour there, and now we're going to do a little quick quiz thing, reinforce some of what we just talked about. So let's get them by the tail and see what we can do. We've got three tail images here, and you should be able to tell what they are based on what I've just shared. We can look at how the tail feathers align with each other on the underside of the perched bird, and whether or not there's any markings on the undertail coverts is good to look at as well. And so what do we see? We see some shorter outer tail feathers on number 1 here. We see the tail feathers all about the same length on number 2. We see a very broad-based tail on number 3 with an irregular wavy pattern underneath. And we can put the birds together and get the whole picture, and there you have it. And you probably got the answers from what I was just saying. The Cooper's hawk, number 1. The sharp-shinned hawk, number 2. And the gauze, number 3. Notice the relative build of these birds as well. All right, so we got them by the tail. Now let's get our head around these guys. So we're mostly looking here at the upper body and going to focus in on the head shape and other features around the head. We've got some young birds, we've got some adult birds. You can tell the adults because of their bluish gray upper parts and their colored, dark reddish colored eyes, contrasting dark caps, and versus the young birds with the brown streaked underneath and more brown on the upper parts. So what do we have? We have number 1. We see, what I see is a bird that has kind of a smallish, largish looking head, but a smallish looking eye, a little bit of a supercilium, but it doesn't go back very far. And the streaks are a little bit sparse here and looks like they're going to peter out. All right, let's move on to number 2, way across here. Here we have a big beady eye looking at this, look at this guy, and it looks like a small head, fairly rounded looking head compared to this one over on the left. And number 3, here's another young bird, and we see this bird's got a nice prominent supercilium. We've got that supraloral ridge giving it that facial disc look. And so let's continue to these adults. Number 4, small head, big beady eye, no contrast here despite the shadow. Here we have a lot of contrast between the crown and the pale nape. Looks like a bigger head relatively. The eye may be looking a little less large. And this one down here, number 6, is easier to tell with that bold white supercilium flaring behind the eye. And we can see the whole pattern here of the head is different. And so indeed we have the Coops number 1 and 5, and the Sharpie 2, 2, and 4, and the gauze down here on the bottom. All right, now we've got to get them on the fly. So let's look at the shapes of the bird and what we can discern about the body and maybe the tails as well. So again, we've got 6 individuals, 2 of each species. I'll just cut to the chase and say that much at least. And what can we see on these on the fly? Notice that I have a non-flying bird here. That's my mistake, but that's all right. We'll go with that. We do have one flying, never mind. So what do we see here? We've got a straight across the front pretty much, and a good head projection, rounded looking tail. And let's contrast with this bird number 3. Wings are bowed forward, squared looking tail, more rounded in general. But look how the wings are pushed forward there. And then we can compare those same 2 patterns on these number 6, rounded tail, straight across, good head projection, squared tail, kind of pushed forward at the wrists and small head projection. Then we've got this big lumbering, hefty, solid looking bird. You can even see on this bird a pale wing bar out here. See that on the wing, even though it's not as good of a view, but you can still pick that out. Here's a pale wing bar on that perch bird, and streaks on the underpart. So it's not flying, so he gave us a break. But again, we've got the Cooper's Hawks, 1 and 6, and 3 and 5 Sharpie, and the gauze 2 and 4. All right, so there we had them all together, and so we don't see them that way in real life. What do you think about this bird? Facing away, not helping us so much in some of the marks we've been looking at. We can still see the wings and the tail, upper part pattern, head contrast, get a little sense of the underparts. What do you think? What do you think? Something making sense, something not making sense? Let's look twice here. Up, now we get a little better view, and we can see, indeed, this is a Merlin. All right, so it's not one of our accipiters, but it's about the same size as a Sharpie, maybe a little bit bigger, similar to a female Sharpie. And you can see that Merlins, as a falcon, have relatively long and pointed wingtips. And the tail is relatively short. Here's the wingtip out here, and here's the tip of the tail. And they have these narrow pale bars and broad dark bars. So some different patterning there. Of course, Merlins have dark eyes versus the accipiters, which have the colored eye or the yellow eye or the red eye. So some differences there. Don't get fooled. These guys are fun because I went to eBird's unidentified accipiter resource. And if you go to explore and do search photos and sounds, for the species, you can type in accipiter SPA, SP period, and you can get birds that birders have not identified when they've submitted their checklist. And you can see what you can do about identifying them. So let's take a quick look at these. And we see that on number 1 here, what do we see? Well, the bird's got its wings pulled in a bit, like it's doing a quick glide. So it's hard to assess wing shape, but we do see kind of a smallish, proportionally smallish head projection. And the tail's looking pretty squared here to my eyes. I don't see any pale tips that are shorter. So that's going to lead me to suggest that we've got a Sharpie there. How about number 2? We just have pretty much a silhouette. Look at the wing is straight across, good looking head projection, fairly long-tailed. If anything, kind of a rounded aspect at the end of the tail. We can't see any other details there. That all adds up to Coops, right? And then number 3, we can only see part of this bird, but what can we see? We see it's a young bird by the vertical streaks, and it looks like it has a relatively large head. And the streaks are kind of sparse and petering out on the lower part of the belly. The eye looks relatively small. Can't see it well, but you can see a little bit, get a sense of it there. So even though we can't see the tail on this bird, we can put that together as Coops. Now, how about this guy sitting in the thicket? These are the views you don't like because it's really hard to get the details on the bird. But we can see some details here. Here's the eyeball. Here's the supercilium. Here are some feathers, and I think I see a tip of a tail feather right there. And the underparts look like they have sparse streaking going to a white undertail coverts. Let's get a little closer look at the head of this bird. You can see that it does have a pale supercilium in this view, but it doesn't continue on back much behind the eye. So that's going to come together for us as hoops. So here's a challenge. Go to Explore and search photos and sounds and type in Accipiter spa and see how many of the birds you can identify that the checklist submitters were not sure about. Some you won't know, others you can work out from what we've shared just tonight. There's our answers. All right, so Bird Bombs only works because of the great photos that I'm able to use from many different photographers, a lot of different people contributing to this Bird Bombs. And I really appreciate everybody's contribution. It makes it possible for me to do what I'm doing here. So thank you all very much. And if you would like to be a Bird Bombs photo contributor, it's actually very easy. If you use eBird, give me permission and I will feel free to use your images that you have in eBird or consider using them for Bird Bombs. All you guys to email me and tell me it's okay to use your images, and then I'll have a be free to go there. So thank you very much to the contributing photographers. And our next Bird Bombs is coming up real soon on December 8th, just like in nearly a couple weeks, 3 weeks away. And our topic on that Bird Bombs was called Better Duck. Better duck, because bird bombs are falling, and better duck because you're going to know how to deal with ducks better after that bird bombs. And we're going to focus on our winter ducks, and there's going to be some fun challenges with images of multiple species and things to sort through. Take a look at past bird bombs if you like. This one will be up in a few days. You can view it again. And all of the other prior bird bombs, there's 8 of them now, can be viewed through our past programs on the DFO Programs and Events page. So I want to thank everyone for watching tonight. We're going to go to some questions and answers. We've had Laura Stedman monitoring that, and we'll see if we have anything to share.
Yeah, thank you. First off, I really loved your quiz titles this time around. This gave me a good laugh.
Cool.
First off, Dana says that this was super helpful, so thank you for the info. Ajit asks, looking back at those sort of range maps that the distribution maps that we looked at early on, about goshawks having a peak in the fall in the mountains, but they don't really migrate. Do you have any sense of like why we might see more of them in the fall, or record more of them in the fall?
Good question. I wish I could easily go back to that graph, but I'm not going to. So I think we do have some migrant goshawks that come into our state. So there is some of that going on, and I think that's reflective partly in some of the birds that end out in the prairie. I do think that a lot of the, depending on which graph was you looking at, is that the mountain graph or was it another one? Probably was the mountain one. So I'd have to go back and look at that and consider that a little bit further. In some of the cases, the birds become more prominent in the late summer because the young have fledged and they vocalize a lot. One thing to consider in looking at the distribution, the graphs for a goshawk, is it's a target species for our local birders. And when there is a nest site that's accessible or a family group that's accessible, a lot of birders go there, and it can actually skew the data. I didn't show some of the graphs, but I can see from one nest site in particular in Staunton State Park that a lot of birders go to visit nearby. The nest access is closed during the time it's active, but birds can get near it, and then after they're done nesting and they fledge, the access is open. And you can see there's actually a spike in frequency because there's a lot more checklists submitted because people are chasing after those individuals. We see the same thing when we look at graphs of some rarities. Then all of a sudden the frequency graph looks big, but it's only because a whole bunch of birders have gone to look at those particular birds. So I'm going to have to take a little further consideration of Ajit's question.
Yeah. Do you know, are they really territorial? Like, do they push the young like out of their territory really quickly? Do you know anything about that?
So the young continue to be fed for a period of time after fledging, and that's one of the reasons they beg a lot, and so they're relatively easy to find when they fledged. And so they'll stick around for a period of weeks, a number of weeks, until they get gone. And I think the adults also can leave their territory for a time and roam around. So I don't know so much that it's that they're being driven out, is they're not being fed as much anymore, and the young need to disperse and start taking care of business on their own.
Makes sense. Yeah. Cool. Do you know, so this is also, Ajit asks, in the East, sharp-shinned hawks are pretty common compared to Cooper's hawks. Do you have any sense of why we have more Cooper's hawks out here, why they're the sort of prominent ones in the Front Range?
Yeah, well, one thing to look at is the distribution overall of the breeding range in North America. The Cooper's hawk is more of a southern nesting species, reaching up into Canada a little bit, I think, but basically along the southern tier, more or less. Like sharp-shinned ranging broadly across Canada and into Alaska. So there's a lot more birds, and up in the eastern Canada area as well. So there's a lot more birds to the north that have to come south in the case of the sharp-shinned hawk. So I think that explains a part of the difference.
Makes sense. And then I had a question. Do you happen to know, do these 3 accipiters hybridize? Is that something we should be trying to worry about? I don't know how I would tell a hybrid Cooper's sharp-shinned hawk from a normal one, but have you ever seen that or seen reports?
Yeah, that's generally, fortunately, that's not something we need to worry about. There is some records of hybridization, I believe, but they're quite rare. And so we don't generally have to debate about that kind of thing. Thankful. I'm really happy for that because it would be a mess.